92.1 WROI. It's 8:07 on this Monday morning, and we are going to go across the console and welcome to the studios Dr. Eric Seward, Woodlawn Hospital, and OBGYN, yeah?
OBGYN.
OBGYN, all righty then. So tell us what's going on in the world of medicine that you bring to the table.
Well, there's all sorts of things going on in the world of medicine, as there always are.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit about diabetes today.
Okay.
But, I think that it's an interesting topic, and we were just talking off air about sugar intake, and I heard an ad in our I think it was in the ABC newscast that played just before that about decreasing sugar in kids' diets.
Right.
A lot of which has to do with childhood obesity, but it also has to do very, very connected with the scourge, if you will, of diabetes that we deal with. I'm going to start talking a little bit just sort of generically about diabetes, but in my world, we're dealing with pregnancy and pregnancy-associated diabetes. That's where my treatment comes in. And I started by talking a little bit about the fact that there are three basic types of diabetes. One is what we sometimes call type 1 diabetes or insulin-dependent diabetes. That's a failure to produce insulin. There is a receptor on the other end. So if you produce insulin out in the cellular level, there's an interaction with a receptor on the cell surface that then allows that cell to accept or not accept glucose and carbohydrates. That insulin receptor can become resistant to insulin if it's overused. So that's sometimes what we call type 2 diabetes, or less accurately, but still oftentimes used, would be non-insulin dependent diabetes, age onset diabetes. Sometimes you'll hear that. Now, that's a very simplified term. There's a thing called a White's classification, which goes into more details on different subsets of diabetes. Doesn't really matter what core kind of diabetes you have. If you've got kidney failure, or if you've got neuropathies or other problems that directly arose from diabetes, that's sort of identified in that White's classification. And so also the amount of time that's gone by that you've had diabetes. And then there's my gestational diabetes, and I'll kind of get into all of these just briefly and kind of land a little bit on my home turf if I can. But I'll start by saying that there's this little organ, it kind of looks like a flag, that lives back behind the stomach and the spleen on the sort of central left side of the anatomy. It's what we call retroperitoneal organ. It kind of lives back behind the balloon cavity that kind of covers the main contents of your guts, basically, and it's called the pancreas. And the pancreas is kind of an interesting little organ that does a couple of different things. It produces some digestive enzymes, but it also is the main producer of insulin. There have been a number of famous people. Most recently, it was Alex Trebek. Back in the day, it was the guy on Dirty Dancing.
Patrick
Swayze, yeah, who have had pancreatic cancer, and those who are familiar with that. I think Michael Landon also died of pancreatic cancer. His might have been stomach. I'm not sure.
I think it was pancreatic.
But pancreatic cancer is one that's not super common, but it is devastating because the survival rate is horrible. It's usually not discovered until later, until it's...
Now, is that because you can't live without a pancreas, or is it because it metastasizes and goes in other places?
Yeah, it's just sort of, if you could imagine the body as a city, and there's like one central intersection. Well, it's too darn close to that central intersection, so it spreads to places that make it difficult to track down. And that's the main issue. You can live without a pancreas. It's not super easy, but we have the ability to give people insulin and the digestive enzymes that they need. But that's the pancreas. The pancreas is just this little organ that makes a few critical hormones for our body, and one of the things that it makes is insulin. And insulin gets pumped out through our body, and it helps basically the cell at the cellular level helps digest sugars.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that kind of makes the next point fairly obvious, but when you take in too much sugar, you sort of overwhelm that system. And you could imagine if somebody were sipping on a Mountain Dew day in and day out, how that might affect one's insulin. And eventually you can actually downregulate those receptors to make them less effective. And in response, the body tries to make more insulin, and you get this sort of bad cycle. The other way that this could happen is if you just have too darn many insulin receptors for the insulin to cover. And this happens when people are obese. Morbid obesity does this too. And it's perhaps a chicken and an egg argument, but insulin, obesity and genetics are big cofactors, and they may be linked together. But you see, especially with type 2 diabetes, the insulin receptor version of diabetes, you'll see a very strong connection with genetics. And a lot of us can look at our families and say, well, Aunt so-and-so and mom, and, got to 50 or 60 and they had diabetes. Whereas type 1 diabetes, or that sort of I'm born without the production capacity of insulin, is less genetic. That's just one of those things that sometimes happens. And depending a little on when it manifests itself, it depends on what the end results are going to be of that. Some people are born with just no insulin or very little insulin, and that's what we call juvenile onset diabetes. It's a version of type 1. Most people, their insulin supply is limited, or their production is limited, and that kind of hits critical mass when they're teenagers. So we see people in either late childhood, teenagers, or young adulthood are being discovered with diabetes. These have a simple cure, and that's take insulin. Kind of an interesting story. I don't know. I think most people in the state of Indiana are familiar with the company Eli Lilly, which is one of the flagship companies in Indianapolis. It employs I don't know how many people, but it's been a cornerstone of downtown Indianapolis for years and years. Eli Lilly himself was the discoverer of insulin, and there was kind of an interesting story about Eli Lilly. And I may be spreading urban legend. I'm not sure, but the story went that he was from out west, and he applied to Johns Hopkins Med School, and he assumed that he was accepted, but he was not accepted. But his non-acceptance letter arrived in the West Coast when he was on a train to the East Coast. So he showed up at med school.
Here I am.
And took a research assistantship while he was waiting to get things sorted out to get into medical school. Ultimately, he did get into medical school, so this isn't to besmirch the name of poor Eli Lilly. But in the meantime, he discovered insulin and and that was the first medicine that Eli Lilly and still is, I think, one of the more the higher, I think it's more than likely generic in 15 different forms now, but and that's all stuff that I'm unaware of, but that's kind of an interesting story. And Eli Lilly, as a company, was the first company to make insulin.
Now, when I know of two separate occasions where somebody had a problem with insulin, and they were two different problems, but they were both adults, and it gave them mental problems. When my mom first came down with it, nobody knew she had it, and she started talking to brothers that she never had. That kind of thing. Now, for a kid, or I guess I should say for a unborn child, a fetus, does this affect their mental development and capabilities as they grow? Because a while ago you said it usually really goes into warp drive when they're a teenager, and that tells me it could be quite frightening, because teenagers already have some...
well, I think it has to do a little more with what in most people that have type 1 diabetes, their pancreases make some insulin. And either reaches critical mass where they can't keep up when kids are teenagers. It does affect psychology, though. The psychology of somebody, and I think this has less to do with diabetes or insulin itself, and more to do with having a chronic condition at a point in life when it's difficult anyway. Imagine a 15-year-old with cancer, or now all of a sudden they have to take injections twice a day. Right. It's just going to affect your psyche. I don't know. Every medicine has side effects, and there's these things are produced and packaged in indefinable ways, and so if you ever listen to any TV commercial for any medicine now, and they go through that super fast, may cause death and 4-hour erections and whatever else, and stuff, and you just you go right down the list, and it's going to be true for insulin too. I think more often what we run into though with diabetes treatments, especially insulin, is sugar variations. When somebody's used to living with a glucose, normal glucoses are usually in the 60 to 100 range, 60 to 95 range, with little spikes after you eat, depending on what you eat. But if you look at what happens with somebody who's got diabetes, they may be living with sugars of 200 or 250 or 300. If you take that person, you all of a sudden make them 60, which might technically be normal. They're going to have some effect. They're going to not feel right. They may be talking to brothers or vice versa. You take somebody that's super well controlled and they go off the charts the other way. Usually the side effects are going to be abrupt changes in glucose.
Now, if the mother has diabetes, does it necessarily follow that the baby does?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Is there a thing here where we drain the mother of her capabilities or her insulin to keep the
and we'll get into that's sort of the next step here is the genetic, the gestational part of this. With type 1 diabetes, these are the folks that, like I said, they're usually diagnosed when they're young or teenagers, young adults. They're going to be required to take insulin. There's different ways to do that. Traditionally, it was a 2-shot a day. Now there are some innovative things with insulin pumps, little devices you can wear that just sort of squirt insulin in as it's needed, sort of preset things. Type 2 diabetes is the more common. That's the one that we all have in our family. That's the very genetic and sort of obesity and age related. Most folks that get type 2 diabetes get it when they're 40, 50 and beyond. There's a tendency for folks that get type 2 diabetes to be obese, although not necessary. It's very common. We're seeing more and more and more of it because, of course, we're seeing more and more and more obesity. We're also seeing the age come down of when this used to be a 50-year-old problem, and now it's becoming sometimes a 25 and 30-year-old problem because we're seeing childhood obesity and issues with, if you walk through any grocery store and look at the sugar content and just about anything that you buy, we are getting inundated with more sugar, and that's taxing those insulin receptors and production capabilities more than ever. And so if you look at the trends in diabetes, that's just generally true. Then you get to my world, which is gestational diabetes, and I would argue theoretically, and I think this has got some valid argument points, so that what gestational diabetes probably is the unmasking of type 2 diabetes. What you have is you have somebody who maybe has a little bit of insulin resistance, probably from genetics, who then gets pregnant and they have an additional sort of insult or demand on their insulin receptors. Plus, there are some hormonal influences during pregnancy that affect diabetes. And ultimately, they then start running higher sugars. And the real manifestation of gestational diabetes, and this isn't too hard to understand, if you pour sugar into the system, the baby's going to be sucking up the sugar. The baby's going to get big. So whenever you hear about a baby being born that's more than 10 pounds, almost always, with rare exceptions, that's a gestational diabetic baby. Sometimes they may not be diagnosed, but these kids come out looking like little linebackers. The other problem that you run into, you could imagine the baby sees a lot of sugar, starts to grow, it starts producing insulin, its own insulin, to deal with all this sugar. It's born. Now all of a sudden the infusion of sugar is gone, but the insulin level is very high, and so all of a sudden their sugars plummet. And this is a problem we oftentimes see with babies, especially from gestational diabetic moms. When they're first born, they have problems maintaining sugar. So pediatricians tend to be on high alert to try to correct that pretty quickly, because that could be a problem if not. And this is something most pediatricians are trained to really watch for. Certainly, you can control a lot of that if you can control those sugars before the baby's born. So a lot of times when we have moms that are diabetic, we're trying to keep a very tight sugar control. I don't know about your mom, but in a lot of situations where you've got somebody on insulin that just generally has diabetes, we're happy. We're trying to get those sugars down to around 100, but we're happy if we keep them under 200, and we just want to avoid that 400 and 500s.
It's been 10 years ago, but I remember he was shooting for 140 or 150.
Yeah.
And that's about what they tell me, because since I got that history in my family, the VA always wants to keep track of this stuff.
Yeah, and that's generally the sort of the approach is you'll take what you can get with somebody with type 1 or type 2 diabetes that's out of control. We would love to see them all perfect, but at the same time, most doctors are pretty accepting if they're reasonable. With gestational diabetes, we try to keep them very tightly controlled. We want those fasting sugars to be under 95 ideally, which is pretty low. That's very normal. And we don't want to see those postprandial or after eating sugars bouncing up much more than 140. We don't want to see them in the 200 range ever if we can, because part of the problem again is you're growing big babies in there. Interestingly, the people that have type 1 diabetes that get pregnant oftentimes have just the opposite problem. They grow very small babies. And the reason they grow very small babies has to do with the fact that if you really blast a baby from the first moment with sugars, their placentas don't work very well.
Oh.
And so they have problems with growth restrictions sometimes. And so it kind of cuts both ways. Usually the gestational diabetes is non-pre-existing. So these are people that come in, their sugars are normal, they don't have diabetes. We test everybody in pregnancy we do a 3-hour sugar test, basically a challenge. And we usually start with a 1-hour test because nobody wants to just do a 3-hour test. And basically they drink a load of sugar, they get their blood drawn in an hour, and we just check. And if it doesn't come back within a normal range, we'll go on and do the 3-hour test. Sometimes we'll do what's called a Hemoglobin A1c. It turns out when sugar floats around in your system, there are little proteins that glycosylate, or they suck up sugar, that live on your blood cells. And blood cells get recirculated or they get reprocessed every 3 months. And so a blood cell that has a lot of this sugar on it, it gives us sort of a look back for the last 3 months. So instead of one single sugar that happened right now, you're looking at how these average sugars looked over the last 3 months. And that gives us a lot of information. And those numbers are normally under 6, under 5.8, depending on the lab. We like to see them, in a pregnant woman, we would love to see them 4.5 to 5.5, no more than that. As they go up and up and up, they are associated with birth defects. And you'll see if somebody has a hemoglobin A1c of 10 or more, they have a really high risk of having birth defects and cardiac defects, and there's a spinal cord tethering syndrome that happens. Those tend to go way up in percentages. We sometimes use those as sort of ideas of where we stand. Now, hemoglobin A1c usually doesn't come into effect during a true gestational diabetic because they're just developing this as they go through their pregnancy. And we usually test it somewhere in the middle of pregnancy. earlier if we have reasons to suspect that somebody might be, if they've had it with last pregnancy, if they're very overweight, strong family history, those might, or if they have symptoms associated with diabetes, they're urinating a lot, having lots of yeast or urinary tract infections, things like that. Turns out bacteria, everybody likes sugar. I like it, you like it, everybody likes it. That's why we have our problems. But so do bacteria, so does yeast. They all like sugar. And so you run somebody sweet, and they're more likely to get these types of infections. And so if you see these happening over and over again, high index of suspicion, maybe this is somebody that's got, borderline diabetes, test them maybe a little bit earlier. Or if somebody came to me and they said, I've never had diabetes before, but my last 3 babies were all 12 pounds, you're getting tested. That's sort of another indicator that either you had it and didn't know it, or you got some wild genetics, lady.
Okay.
So I had a funny, normally these things follow very, very tight patterns, but I had a lady who came in pregnant, and she was skinny as a rail. No reason to suspect this lady had diabetes. I tested her, 1-hour test, and it came back bad enough that I almost just started her on insulin. And she begged and begged and begged to, no, don't do that yet. Let me do the confirmatory test. And I was really worried about sending this lady into like a diabetic coma or something with that test, but she passed every one of them, and so I have to know what gives. And she came back and she said, well, you said I could eat before that 1-hour test, which technically you can. It's not supposed to be a fasting test. I'm like, okay, what'd you eat? And she had gone to IHOP on an all-you-can-eat pancake day, had 7 pancakes. Only a pregnant woman, only a skinny pregnant woman could do this. Do you like syrup? Oh, I love syrup. Smothered them in syrup. So I laughed at this, but then I did my own test because it seemed outrageous, what her numbers were. Mm-hmm. And my glucoses are normal, and I've tested them after meals, and they've come back 120, 115, 120. I had a pancake meal. I couldn't eat 7 pancakes on the best day of my life. When I was a teenager, I think that would have pushed it. But I had, 3 pancakes smothered in syrup, and I had a 190. So it just goes to show you what you eat matters. And we tend to, once we diagnose gestational diabetes, we start with putting people on a diet. Most of the time, if you put people on a low-carb, low-sugar diet, you can control sugars well enough just with gestational diabetes. There are some medicines, and this is true for both type 2 and gestational diabetes, that are oral medicines, and there's a few of them on the market. We a lot of times use metformin, which is the sort of the older version. And metformin is kind of interesting. Diabetes and fertility are closely linked, as are polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a different thing I deal with a lot. There's a thing called metabolic syndrome, where people overproduce adrenal hormones. And these are all things that are very interlinked. All these things can go together, but several years now, it's been probably 20, 25 years ago now, there was a group of folks that were diabetic that they were testing some of these medicines on, and a subset of that group was having problems with fertility, and they got pregnant taking metformin. And so metformin is one of the things that is in our arsenal for certain types of infertility too. It's a very, very kind of interesting link, but it has to do with insulin receptors, and there's a few different things that are produced in the normal cycle that have to do with insulin. There's a thing called insulin-like growth factor that affects insulin receptors too. And these things all seem to be interlinked, and it's hard to know whether it's the chicken or the egg, whether the ovary is the main culprit or whether it's the insulin receptor and that interaction that's the main culprit. But we know that when we give some people metformin, that that increases their fertility. And it doesn't increase everybody's fertility. If you're not a diabetic, it's not going to change your fertility. Insulin does not do that. So if we put somebody, I mean, unless somebody's sugars are running 600 and we put them on insulin and make them 100, that might make them healthier. But it doesn't have that same specific fertility side effect. And so, again, we don't have a lot of our gestational diabetic folks on insulin. It turns out that if you just take all the positive 1-hour tests, only about 15 to 20% of them are going to come back positive on a confirmatory test. So that probably indicates that they're borderline or they ate pancakes that morning. With the folks that test positive on a confirmatory test, only 10 to 15% of them are going to require insulin. Most of them can be managed with diet alone or diet plus maybe an oral medicine.
Okay, very good. We've been speaking with Dr. Eric Seward, Woodlawn Hospital, OBGYN, and about diabetes and insulin, and it seems to be a pretty important thing in our lives.
It is, yeah.
That little pancreas does some things. It's not like your appendix. It actually does some things. All right, Doc, we thank you very kindly for your time.
All right, thank you.
We appreciate it.
See you next month.
Uh-huh.